Hey, so I'm just gonna make a video in response. All right, so what do we have here? Usually when I do this, so usually is more often than not, so that's a most modifier. So we can keep that in mind when we're trying to match to the answer choice. So these ones here potentially would match with most. Um, and everyone's not going to match. Um, some is not going to match. Many also is not going to match because many is equivalent to some. Okay. So really we'd just be left with these last two, based on the word usually being a modifier in that first premise. And then in the second premise, we have a conditional phrase only when. So we would definitely need to have some conditional. We do have cannot, which works as a conditional. This is lacking a vivid imagination. So can't disturb people who don't have this. And then the conclusion, what do we have in the conclusion? In the conclusion, we have must be that the electric outlet is usually turned on, and we have most and most for the conclusion. So in terms of modifiers, D and E are equivalent. So we actually have to get into the uh like the factors and the ideas and nouns and how they relate to each other with those modifiers. So I would start with the conclusion, um, and then try to kind of match things up using the elements in the conclusion. So this one, most people must have vivid imaginations. And here, most people with vivid imaginations must find the plot disturbing. So in D, we have uh, the plot being disturbing shows up in the premises, but then does not show up in the conclusion. So that would be something that um, I would check here. It seems like sound or making a squeaking sound is something that shows up in the premises but doesn't show up in the conclusion. Um, and that's a nice match. Um, yeah, yeah. So just based off of those, I would be going with D. I'm going to go ahead and actually read it. Merle says, usually when I insert a dollar bill into the change machine at the office, it makes a squeaking sound before it produces change. But the machine can make the sound only when the electric outlet it is plugged into is turned on. So there's a requirement, right, that it has to be the electric outlet has to be turned on in order for it to make that sound. Therefore, they're coming to the conclusion that it must be that the electric outlet it usually is turned on. So they're making it this generalization about just because most of the time I happen to interact with this change machine, the electric outlet is turned on. That must mean that it's usually turned on, that it's turned on most of the time, which is not necessarily true. Perhaps this person only uses the change machine during business hours, and that's the only time when that electric outlet is turned on, is during business hours. And so, actually, the rest of the time, it's not turned on, and that ends up being most of the time it's not turned on. So, that's the flaw. Looking at D, most people who have read this new horror novel found the plot disturbing. Okay, so it's this subset of people who are going to find the plot disturbing because it's the people who have read this novel. But the plot cannot disturb anyone who lacks a vivid imagination. So you need to have a vivid imagination, excuse me. You need to have a vivid imagination in order for the plot to disturb you, just like the electric outlet needs to be turned on in order for the machine to make a sound. Um, and uh, and then the conclusion, rather than just saying most people um, who have read this new horror novel have vivid imaginations. They go broader than that and say that most people, generally most people, period, right, must have vivid imaginations. So looks like the flaw matches up really nicely. So I'm happy with D. Um, and I wouldn't be worried about going into E in any depth at that point once I've done that analysis. Hope that helps.